Hello. Welcome to, it's not exactly Friends on Books. I have that series and I did a Friends on Books yesterday, but this is specifically because Tori and I were doing a buddy read of a book called The Things They Carried.
I think we're good. Yeah.
I think we're good.
I'm getting my audio.
Back.
Whoa, this is really weird. I'm getting my audio repeated to me like 30 seconds later.
Oh, that's weird. I'm not getting. I'm just hearing.
I'm not hearing it either.
How about people in the chat? Can you hear Matt once or twice?
Now I'm getting your audio repeated 30 seconds later.
Mine or Philip?
Both.
Wow.
Hang on, my kitten is burglarizing my
This
door.
is really weird. People, we will be right back.
Yeah, I've never heard of anything like that. You're having some kind of feedback thing. All right, we're still here, everybody. So
hey guys.
double the
We're
Matt.
just
Yeah.
taking over Matt's channel real quick.
Yes, we are taking over Matt's channel, and we're going to do only cat videos from now on.
Yes, here's a cat video to keep everyone entertained. I always tell people if you hear it sounds like someone's trying to break down my door while I'm in a chat. It's because my kitten can open doors and he's trying to get in. Is it still happening, Matt?
It's still happening? Oh, dear. Well,
Here, let me try something. Does that help at all? No?
no. Okay.
Okay, so it's not me.
Huh. I don't think it's either of us, Tori. I think it's completely Matt's fault. Whatever it is.
Not
I
to
don't
point
think
fingers.
people in the. Can you try it without your headphones, maybe, Matt?
Yeah.
Try it without the headphones. And everybody who's in the chat, you guys are not hearing us twice, right?
Do you have it open in another window, Matt?
Everybody who's in the chat, you guys.
Ooh, now I'm hearing it.
I'm hearing myself in the background, though.
No, I don't have a headphone mic. I think it's actually something in my browser. I am going to restart my browser and we will be back in just a sec.
We'll stay here.
Okay.
So once again, going back to the cat videos we're doing.
Yes, my cat left. Now we're really. Now we got a problem.
Well, while Matt is figuring out the technical stuff, I think one thing we can do here is I will talk about the things they carried from my experience of the book, and then Tori, maybe you could talk about your experience in a non-spoiler way. And then hopefully when Matt gets back, we'll be ready to talk some more details and spoilers. I just want to say that this is a story, actually. I teach the title story, The Things They Carried. So it's a book, The Things They Carried. It's a collection of short stories that are very much interrelated, but it's also the title story. So with The Things They Carried in quotes rather than italicized. So the story that I'm very familiar with, because I teach it every semester, is the title story, not the rest of the book. So I won't be saying much about the rest of the book today.
Sure.
But I am very familiar with the title story because it is a story that I find it quite a fascinating story to teach because it gets a lot of reactions from my students.
Yeah.
It gets a big reaction from students. And because I teach at a community college, I do have a lot of veterans who are in my classes.
Sure. Yep.
And every single one of them, without exception, has said something along the lines of, wow, Tim O'Brien really nailed it here. I mean, this is something that every veteran student I've had, particularly those who have seen combat, have spoken like this guy, he's like, this is really so true to my experience, even though most of those students are not Vietnam War veterans. They're in fact veterans of much later wars, but there's just so many things they have in common. So Tim O'Brien really nails it. Of course, he is a Vietnam War veteran himself, and he has, I think, somehow captured the experience that a lot of people went through and go through in combat, in war. So it's a story that really speaks strongly to my veteran students, but also to those of us who have never been in combat. And I feel like it's a thing that's very important to recognize, that what Tim O'Brien offers us, people who, most of us never experience combat, we don't serve in the military, but we do get this window, I think, into that experience. We will never know what it's really like, but we get this window, and I think it's terribly important. And I think most of my students definitely appreciate that. So
Yeah. What class do you teach it for, Philip?
Intro to Literature.
Okay, nice.
Yep. We do lots of short stories, and it's just one of the short stories that I do, but it's one of the most, I think, one of the most powerful for sure.
Yeah. Well, and I like that you are introducing it as, like, not just for the content, but also for its merit as a literary piece, because it's, I couldn't get over that through the whole book, just how brilliantly written it was. And I'm sure that's something we'll get into as we get farther into the discussion, but it's just, as a literary piece by itself, it's just incredible.
Yeah, it was stunning writing. I mean, to me, very surprising writing. Like I hadn't heard really anything about him. I don't know anything about how he writes or what he's written before, other than this or any of it. I had no expectations, but he, after a while, I started to get it. In that story, just that singular story, I just kept being surprised by the way he would drop things.
Mm-hmm.
There would just be certain things dropped in the middle of, like, he'd make a list of things and they'd all be relatively mundane and normal, and then there'd be something horrible dropped in there with it. And after a while, and that happens all through the entire book, and after a while I was like, oh, this is the soldier mindset. This is the expression of the bizarre world that they lived in, and the kind of craziness that they all became infected with. You know, and numbing down somehow, or just sort of reacting to everything as if it's the same, even though one thing is a can of Coke and another thing is a murdered body, or, you know, it's just like this, to me, shocking, because it's not the way you think, but it really brought across some of the way maybe they thought, you know.
So what are your broad, spoiler-free reactions, Tori, to all of this?
This has been, I try really hard to sprinkle historical fiction in with my fantasy reads, because obviously fantasy is oftentimes very heavily inspired by, I would say pretty broadly, actually is pretty broadly inspired by it. So I grew up, my grandfather is a Civil War expert. And has always been, I grew up from the time I could hear words to my grandfather telling me war stories, both Civil War, World War II. And so I've always kind of been more interested and open to that kind of story in general. And I have a lot of family members who have served in the military in different wars, different branches. And so it's something that I feel really passionate about, you know, being more aware of the kind of world that they lived in and what they experienced. And this one was on my radar. I'd heard from several people that this was, like, if you were going to start somewhere with the Vietnam War, that this is where you start. And my great uncle, who was a medic with the Navy, and he ended up going on shore to support the Marines during Vietnam. And he was in a lot of the heaviest battles there. He spoke publicly about his experience for the first time a couple of years ago, and I was able to be there for that. And that kind of put this book even more on my radar, because I wanted to, you know, because obviously there's only a certain level that many veterans are willing to speak to, and that is completely understandable and okay. And so to me, this was kind of just a further study of the doors that he was opening with his experience.
Joanna, it's actually fiction. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking that Tim O'Brien is writing about his actual experiences. It's based on his experiences as a Vietnam War veteran, but it's fictionalized. So
it's interesting though. It's one of the things that Tori and I were texting about this because we were both reading it basically at the same time. And it's later in the book, but he actually talks about that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a thing, it's hard to explain. He's talking about truth in lots of different ways. He's talking about, okay, there's truth as in accuracy, like you're representing exactly the things that really happened.
Right.
And he says really clearly, he says, nobody who tells a story tells that truth.
Yeah.
That's not what a story is.
It's a really short one called Good Form.
Yeah.
And there's a line in there I can read that's not, it doesn't really spoil anything. It just kind of sums up what the chapter is about. I want you to feel what I felt. I want you to know why story truth is truer sometimes than happening truth. And he it's just a very 2-page thing where he talks about, and it kind of confused me just because I was trying to figure out okay, because he went back and forth a couple of times. So I was like, okay, so what's the how much of this is actually true? And I think it's okay that question wasn't ever answered.
And he comes back to that throughout the whole book over and over again as other soldiers. Especially there's one called Rat Kiley. Rat Kiley is always telling stories.
Yep.
And they're always obviously exaggerated. Mm-hmm. But everybody else already knows the exaggerated stories. So they're contributing to them. And they become even more exaggerated. But they're contributing because Rat Kiley is telling a truth that they all share. Mm-hmm. Even if it's not an accurate story, it's their experience. It's representing the experience that they all share, and that's sort of a constant theme through the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, Rat Kiley is the medic, I think, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And he collects comic books, I think. Is that
he has a stack of comic books in his medicine bag and
M&Ms or something?
A bag of M&Ms in case things get really bad.
Yeah, that's one of the things that fascinates me about what O'Brien does with, especially in the title story. And I think a lot of the themes that he sets up in that title story just reverberate through the entire book, all the stories. But it's interesting how in the title story, the things they carried, and we're doing spoilers now. Are we doing spoilers? Is that what are we?
I think for that story, especially we can, because it's the first story. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So what he does, and this isn't terribly spoilery really, but he sets out in the beginning, giving us all these physical things they carry with them. Just the weight of everything, just the standard issue equipment that all the soldiers carry.
And he gives the exact weight of everything.
The exact weight, and he tells you just how much stuff they have. And then there are specialized ones who have to carry extra stuff. And he just goes through this long list of stuff. And it's interesting because all that standard issue stuff. Now, I just said a little while ago, I didn't serve in the military, but I grew up in the military. I was an Army brat. So I like Tori, have a sort of affection or I guess something of that nature for the military or for military people. I can remember as a kid, soldiers would go by in their tanks and stuff, and I'd be out there with the other little boys saluting, and we thought they were my first heroes, really. And they were, now to look back, they were a bunch of kids, really. But but it's interesting how O'Brien gives us a sense of them having to become part of a larger unit by listing all this stuff that they all standard issue have to carry. And at the same time, though, shortly after, he tells us these very personal items that they carry as well. It's as if these soldiers, they recognize that they have to be part of this cohesive unit, but they're also making some kind of attempt to preserve their individuality, I think, at the same time. So the little funny things, like one soldier has his girlfriend's pantyhose around his neck. Another soldier has his grandfather's Bible, another soldier has the comic books, so they all have these very personal things that distinguish them. It's as if they're trying to hold on to a piece of themselves. And of course, Jimmy Cross has the letters from Martha and the pebble that he keeps in his mouth.
Yeah.
And that's a crucial thing there, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. And also it seemed like, especially that story, it seemed like it's a contrast all the time between the death that they're carrying and the life that they're carrying.
Yep.
Like so much of especially the really heavy things they're carrying are to kill people with.
Yeah.
It's ammunition and grenades and guns and, all that sort of stuff. But then they've all got something that's more about life. It's more about like enjoyment or memory of an easier and more positive life back home or that kind of thing. I've actually got a quote, which was in that particular story, was one of my favorite bits. And I think it's towards the end of it. They carried all they could bear and then some, including a silent awe for the terrible power of the things they carried. So a lot of what he's talking about, like what they're carrying, a lot of the things as it goes on more and more, that story, a lot of the things they're carrying are not physical at all.
Right.
He's talking much more about the emotions that they're carrying or the memories that they're carrying or, and that those are the heaviest things maybe.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was, go ahead, Philip.
No. You please, Tori.
One of the first tabs, I have so many tabs in this book. One of the first things that I tabbed was there's a line that it says the things they carried were largely determined by necessity. And then it goes into, there's kind of I love the way he uses stream of consciousness in his writing style so much, and especially in the certain areas that he uses it. Because he goes into this kind of, like you said, this rattling off of all of these equipment pieces and stuff. And then it kind of stream of consciousness is into, Henry Dobbins he liked syrup on his pound cake and he liked, that kind of stuff. And I made the note that there's such a desperation to cling to things that make you human in a situation where everything is so heavily dehumanized. You have to dehumanize yourself to a certain degree, and you have to dehumanize the people on the opposite side in order to be able to, even handle what you're doing. And so that kind of clinging to humanity and those little details of this, I'm keeping this on me as a reminder of, who I am outside of this sphere.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You mentioned how this story is really about the psychological burden, not so much the physical, although it's pretty impactful as well. But it really is about the psychological burden that, by the way, never gets put down. Once you're a soldier and you've been in combat, those psychological burdens are going to stay with you, much the way grief stays with people. You just have to learn to carry them. And it's interesting because to me, the biggest insight from that story is close to the part that you read, Matt. I'm going to read it. This is not terribly spoilery either, but to me, it's one of the biggest themes that he gets across so effectively. I'm going to read a quote here. They carried all the emotional baggage of men who might die. Grief, terror, love, longing. These were intangibles, but the intangibles had their own mass and specific gravity. They had tangible weight. So he's talking about the psychological burden that comes from fear of death, right? You could die any moment here, and then you see that in the story. It happens. Yeah. You could die any moment, and that is very stressful. But there's another even bigger source of stress, source of fear. It's not the biggest fear is not fear of dying. This is the biggest insight for me in this story. I think it's just magnificent how he gets it across. The biggest fear is not the fear of dying. I'll keep reading that quote. They carried shameful memories. They carried the common secret of cowardice, barely restrained, the instinct to run or freeze or hide. And in many respects, this was the heaviest burden of all, for it could never be put down. It required perfect balance and perfect posture. They carried their reputations. And here's the part that I find so interesting. They carried the soldiers' greatest fear, which was the fear of blushing. Men killed and died because they were embarrassed not to. It was what had brought them to war in the first place. Nothing positive, no dreams of glory or honor, just to avoid the blush of dishonor. They died so as not to die of embarrassment. In other words, their fear of death is outweighed by the fear of shame. And that's the reason that's all that keeps them there. But there's this tension between those two fears. Yeah. And that is something that never really gets put down, I think.
Yeah, and it's remarkably insightful. I mean, again, same as you, I've never served in the military. My dad was in the army. And so I don't really know what it's like at all. But a lot of military stuff you read is much more about the honor or the skill in fighting or the camaraderie or whatever. And like he so deftly cuts through all of that. And it's like the thing they're really afraid of is shame, embarrassing themselves. Being a coward is worse than being shot, you know? Which is, I think, understandably probably the motivation of pretty much any army at that level, you know?
At that level. Yeah.
Everybody's sticking together because you don't want to look worse than the guy next to you, you know? And also, I mean, there's a story, I won't get into the details, spoilers and so on, but there's a story later on in the book which revolves around the consequences of one soldier being a coward, where he freezes up and doesn't do what he should have done.
Right.
And that has huge consequences on the rest of them, you know, and is very damaging to them as a group. It's damaging to the morale. It also obviously physically damaging to people that didn't get the help they needed from him and that kind of thing. So yeah, he explores that quite a lot. I'm interested because I'm sitting here with two authors. I'm interested in what in this book maybe or story is something that made you think about the way you write, if anything. Yeah.
You want to go first, Tori?
I can.
Actually, just quickly to say, this is kind of how we even got on this book, because Tori and I and a couple others, we had my, I think, second Friends on Books. And afterwards, after we had gone off live, Tori and I were talking about military fantasy because she's writing something where these things come up. And I mentioned that I had heard from Philip that this was cool. So we decided to read this together, and The Black Company as well, which we haven't read yet. But yeah, so that is why I was thinking, well, you know, what kind of impact did it have on your writing?
I mean, one of the things that I think I always try to bear in mind is like, and we've talked about, this has come up on other live streams too, where I think when people hear military fantasy, they think bloody, gory, like how, like just shock value. And it's all about, like we talked about, the strategy and the tactics and the this, that, and the other thing. And I feel like for me, at least, writing military fantasy, that's a responsibility, as with anything you put in your books, that, you know, I feel like I have a responsibility to the people that I know who have been in military situations to tell it in a way that doesn't just focus on the physical side of it, to focus on, you know, it's not just, oh, they go and they have a war and they go home. Well, there's a huge psychological piece to that I think gets missed oftentimes. And so this, I loved reading this, and it kind of just reaffirms and kind of concretes my hope that when I'm working through my character's eyes in the military experience they have, that I'm going to be able to portray it in the different ways that psychologically it impacts them, as well as it's not just about who's going to win the war and how much land, and you know, that's the secondary part of it in my mind.
Just to sort of continue some of those thoughts, I think a lot of the times what we're trying to do as writers is to convey human experience.
Yep.
And a lot of the time we can draw from our own experience, but those of us who have never served in a military or been in combat, we'll never really be able to do that in a firsthand kind of way. Mm-hmm. So in the way that Tim O'Brien does here, And I ask my students all the time, do you think it matters that Tim O'Brien actually was in this war, that he served? And all the students are like, yes, that matters. That gives this story a layer of authenticity.
Yeah.
To most people, pretty much universally, my students all think that that's an important factor.
Yep.
And then you have authors like Glenn Cook who've taken similar experiences and fictionalized them in a fantasy setting, and in The Black Company. And he's drawing from his real life experience in a way that I can't, because I have not been in combat. But then you have writers like Steven Erikson and myself and Tori and anyone else who values these stories, who we've taken nods, we've taken cues. We're trying to replicate what we see in these stories and be as authentic as we can and respectful as we can, I think. And so, and there are times when you're writing your story when you do have firsthand experience, then times when you have to do some research and make stuff up and pretend like I don't know anything about sailing. I've been sailing once. I have a scene in my book with a blacksmith, and what do I know about being a blacksmith? But I have a friend who is a blacksmith, so I asked him, okay, what I need in this scene, and I basically based the whole description of that smithy on my friend's descriptions. So I'm leaning on someone else's experience and knowledge. I think that's what we're doing when we read writers like Tim O'Brien and Glenn Cook. We're sort of, I mean, you're learning anytime you're reading any author, anytime. And so because I don't really know what combat is like, I get my ideas about it from authors like this, from films and, you know, stuff like that. That's the best I can do. So.
Yeah.
Well, it's a live stream with me and Philip Chase. So
Mlazen has to come up.
You got it. I was very often reminded reading this story of the way the soldiers in Malazan are written. Yeah, it really confirmed a lot of the feeling. Like reading Malazan, it's a totally different world. It's fantasy. It's made up by a guy who wasn't in the military. So I read it and I think I can kind of imagine soldiers acting like this, but I don't know. And maybe Steven Erikson doesn't either, you know. But reading this, I'm like, this, I think, like you said, it has an authenticity to it. Tim O'Brien was there. It's based on actual experiences he had. Friends of his actually died. And he's writing about the way soldiers interacted and how weird they were in some ways, and their humor, even in the middle of like, I could die any minute, and all that sort of stuff. And it's bouncing back to particular scenes in Malazan all the time. Because it was like, this sounds just like Fiddler and Hedge, or you know, whatever. So yeah, I don't know if he read this. Have you ever mentioned this to him, to Erikson?
Oh yes, yeah. He has read Tim O'Brien's The Things That Carried.
Yeah. Okay.
Most definitely. I think Glenn Cook is much more often cited. And if you're still in the chat, you could probably confirm this. But Glenn Cook is more often cited. But I believe that Steven Erikson would say that authors like Tim O'Brien, and he would be able to name several others, but also Vietnam films as well about the war would have been, I think, a fairly important influence for him as well.
Yeah.
Okay, there's AP confirming. Yeah.
Erikson has read a lot of war fiction.
I have mentioned Tim O'Brien specifically to Steven Erikson in the past, and he has absolutely. Yeah, I believe my impression is that he's read The Things That Carried, and that is an important influence. Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
And war movies. Yeah.
Well, and I think too, like this is where part of the way that we interact and show empathy for other people isn't because we've experienced the exact same thing. It can be, but oftentimes it goes back to, you know, what experiences have I had where I have felt isolated, or I have felt, and insert whatever, word here, and it doesn't give you the same experience, but you can start to, empathize with that feeling and imagine just on such a massive scale, what it must be like. And because I went through this book and I marked so many quotes that rang true for me because I have CPTSD. And so I was reading this book through the lens of someone who has not been in combat, but who has been, through that kind of survival to PTSD mentality, and just incredibly moved by the way that he was able to capture a lot of the ways that it manifests in life after, if that makes sense. So I have so much to say about the psychology of this book, and just how powerful the imagery that he used. Like, it's really hard to describe, that kind of mental illness, and he just does it in such a brilliant way, I think, that I would easily just, anyone who's looking for the war fiction side of it, but also people who want to understand PTSD more, I would immediately point them to this book.
Yeah.
So Matt, can we talk about a specific incident in it is
Yeah.
in the title story? And this is a spoiler, so be warned. There is a very tragic death in the title story.
I was thinking about it beforehand, and to me stories can be spoiled if there's a surprise in the story that the story depends on.
Right.
And I was thinking almost nothing in this could be a spoiler to me, because like, it being what it is, you expect that people are going to be dying. He's going to tell you about that. I mean, it's obvious. So none of it feels too spoilery for me. But if you are worried about spoilers in the first story in the book, then you should probably plug your ears or leave.
We'll wave when we're done talking about this, but I think it's going to take a little while. So I'm thinking about Ted Lavender's demise.
Yes.
And this is something that is basically the heart of this title story. And the actual death happens so randomly, and just kind of like, boom, it happens, and then suddenly he's down. Right. And that's something that the other soldiers keep remarking on, especially Kiowa, is like, like he just dropped like a sack of cement. He can't. He just.
Well, it was also so remarkably mundane. The unit or the squad, they sit down to rest. Ted Lavender gets up to go pee.
Right.
And is standing there peeing, and he gets shot in the head.
Gets shot in the head, and then the other soldiers
who knows where.
Obviously in shock. Some are trying to deal with it with humor, like he was zapped while zipping, that sort of thing. And it's just, there's an array of responses among the soldiers too, and some want to keep talking about it, others say shut up, stop talking about it. So there's an array of responses there. But I'm particularly interested in Jimmy Cross's reaction, because he's the lieutenant, and he's been responsible. He is responsible. It's an interesting question. I want to ask what you two think, because this is a question I always ask about this incident. And I ask, considering that Jimmy Cross is 20-something years old, 24, I think. He's a kid. I mean, when I think about when I was 24, I was an idiot. I don't know about most 24-year-olds, but I was definitely an idiot. I was barely able to handle myself, let alone be responsible for other people's lives. And he's been thrown into this situation where supposedly he's in charge. He's responsible for these lives. And he was daydreaming about Martha while this happened, when Ted Lavender was shot. And so he blames himself. And the question I ask my students is Jimmy Cross right? Should he be blaming himself? And the interesting thing is, my veteran students, to a person, have always said, and not in a judgmental way, not in a mean way, but in a very understanding way, they've always said, yeah, he's to blame in that situation. He should have been, he should have had his soldiers set up a perimeter. He should have done this and that. And it was sloppy, So what do you guys think of that, though? Is Jimmy Cross being a little too hard on himself there?
I think it's probably both. I mean, he becomes pretty neurotic about it. I mean, I think, yes, he is being hard on himself. But I mean, it's a military squad in enemy territory, and he was not on top of what he should have been doing. You know, and you can't say if he had set up everything correctly, because I mean, Ted Lavender was shot by a sniper that nobody could even see.
Right.
That could have happened no matter where they were.
Right.
But him walking away, the commander of the squad, just letting him walk away, not pulling him back, not setting up in some sort of more defensible position, it does kind of make it his responsibility in the end, you know? And yeah, he's in his 20s. He's a kid. He has no, he's never going to be a great commander at that age, and probably got extremely limited training. But in the end, the situation they're in, it is his responsibility, you know? I totally see that.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too if you contrast that with the story later on where, and I'm trying to remember the name of the second medic.
Oh yeah, I don't remember his name either, but yeah.
Yeah, like when we're
Rat
talking
gets
about
transferred to Japan for a while, and then there's
yeah,
another.
and you're talking about, you know, blame for a situation where, you know, someone was in this environment and had a job to do and, you know, dropped the ball. Was it his fault that Tim O'Brien was, or the narrator was, you know, had as much
Jorgensen.
Jorgensen, yeah.
No.
Was it
Ted,
his?
Ted Jorgensen? Was it?
No, it's
I thought
Bobby.
it started with a B.
Bobby Jorgensen. Or
Oh, okay,
Jorgensen.
okay. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
You know, is he responsible for the amount of damage that was sustained because he dropped the ball? Yeah. You know, so I think but is he responsible for the environment he's in? No. And I think that's kind of an important distinction. So for me, is Lieutenant Cross responsible for the actions he did not take? Yes. Is he also responsible for the fact that Ted Lavender died in the war? No.
Yeah, and I mean, also, like, Ted himself was doing something stupid.
Right.
You know, I mean, his commanding officer should have probably stopped him.
Right.
But, like, you don't just do that.
Right.
He was doing something he shouldn't have been doing. And, you know, that he's not responsible for getting shot because of it necessarily, but he was setting himself up to get shot,
Yeah.
you know?
A couple of questions or observations in the chat. Scarecrow asks, does he talk about war crimes? Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, he does.
After Ted Lavender's death, in fact, the squad does some pretty horrible things in retaliation, frankly.
Yeah.
And DK Moon, I have to agree with you there. You're being paranoid if no one is there. And so in a situation like combat, your paranoia is warranted, but
especially in Vietnam.
Yeah, especially in Vietnam. Any other context, though, you're crazy if you're acting that way. So it's like, yeah, that's a great observation.
Yeah.
So
one of the things he talks about later, I mean, it's not really spoilers, but one of the stories is, I mean, it's about PTSD, but it's specifically, again, what this book is really about is stories. You know, more than anything, it's about stories. And one of the soldiers, it jumps forward in time, and there's a friend of his who's returned, and he's back at home in America, and the hardest thing for him is he can't tell anyone. he can't bring himself to honestly tell it anyway for a number of different reasons, and it goes into that, but he can't share anything he's experienced with anyone.
Right. Well, they won't understand. They won't understand.
Yeah. Well, and it also, like, it's like spreading suffering, basically. You know, like all the people who love him, and if he tells them what he really experienced, they will suffer. And yeah, and it's so far out of anything that anyone in normal society can relate to, that he just feels extremely isolated, and he can't let it out, and he can't share it. And it's, yeah, it's a hard book.
It is a hard book. Yeah.
Yeah.
Scarecrow says there are no good guys when it comes to war. It's humans in their most animal form. Also, I agree with you, Tori. Is the lieutenant to blame for one of his cubs dying, or the jungle and nature they live in?
Yeah, it's a good way to put it. I think he blames himself, of course, and he ends up burning. He burns the letters that he had gotten from Martha, who he was never really sure how much she was into him in the first place.
she was kind of obviously not into him.
Yeah. But he wanted to think that maybe she was.
It was his daydream of home.
Yeah. And the whole pebble in his mouth thing, and it was all about this dream. The pebble is a symbol, and the letters obviously were too. And so his response to Ted Lavender's death is to burn those letters. And it's like he's saying to himself, okay, I have to shut off this longing I have, this desire to preserve some of myself. Otherwise, I'm going to be responsible for more deaths like this. So he makes a decision. His name is Jimmy Cross, okay? So he makes a sacrifice in the sense of his individuality goes out the window, and he needs to just focus on what he's doing there. In this place, he doesn't want to be at all. Keeping in mind that a lot of these soldiers were drafted. We weren't talking about a volunteer, complete volunteer military back then. So I don't remember if Jimmy Cross volunteered or if he was drafted or what, but he's clearly decided that he's got to give up on his individuality, his dreams, his hopes for his own personal life, and just be in this hell, and try to do as best he can with his 24 years of experience, keeping these other young men alive. So it's really incredible.
The draft is also an interesting thing in the story. Tim O'Brien talks about himself getting drafted, and that he thought it was a mistake. That he thought, it's obviously a paperwork mistake because I'm in university and I shouldn't be drafted, and something had changed in the draft law during the war or something. So like last year he shouldn't have been drafted. He wouldn't have been on the list, but something changed and he got drafted, and he was actually waiting for it to be cleared up, that he wouldn't have to go. And then suddenly he's in Vietnam,
Yep.
Yeah, that's right, Eric.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's kind of it's really hard to look at something like that objectively as a person to say, is this my responsibility? What could I have done different? How do I change? Then so this doesn't happen again, or whatever. Versus that, if you stay in the blame, you never get out of it. Like it's kind of a pit, and you can't, you stay in that subjective forever instead of being able to, well, what if it happens again? Are you going to change something so that the next guy, has a better chance, or that you're setting up? And, and again, this is where me not having been in combat, I can say all of this, but in the moment, we're all human. I mean, any of us, and especially in that kind of a survival situation, they're running on almost no sleep. They're on survival mode, like just edge constantly. And that just totally messes your brain up. So, again, that goes back to, on a perfect day, it shouldn't have happened maybe, but it's trying to lay responsibility in one place for something like that is just impossible in my mind.
Well, there was also a feeling to me of futility anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he ends up sacrificing himself as a human in a way, so that he can be a better lieutenant.
Yep.
And in the end, it probably doesn't matter anyway, because no matter where they are, no matter what preparations they're making, there are still random things coming out of the jungle and killing people.
Yeah. Well, you see that later with his reaction to Kiowa's death.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah. One object that gets carried that sticks out to me is Norman Bowker, I think, is the one who carries the thumb, a human severed thumb around with him. I think it was one of the other soldiers who cut it off, but it was Bowker who carries it around as some kind of totem, or that's a little bit different from the other objects that the soldiers are carrying to preserve pieces of themselves.
Yeah.
The thumb is an example, common enough, I'm sure, of dehumanizing the enemy, right? I mean, that's pretty much what it is. If you're going to be in a situation where you have to take on the terrible burden of taking other lives, how are you going to cope with that? How are you going to get yourself to be able to do that, to follow those orders, to save your own life too? So under those circumstances, I think a common enough thing is you dehumanize, and one way of doing it is just carrying that thumb around with him all the time in order to basically say, these are not humans. It's like carrying around a lucky rabbit's foot or something.
And I think that whole interaction is interesting because he doesn't do it himself. Like you said, I think it's the first guy he killed, the first enemy he killed. And it was almost an accident. Like this guy appeared in front of him on the trail. He shot him. Mm-hmm. And one of the other guys gives him the trophy. So it's like, it's that culture of, like when you were talking about PTSD, Tori, I was thinking, PTSD, the way you experience it, or the way somebody who's had abuse or anything like that in our society experiences it, is one thing. But then having a culture, a squad and a whole army that has a culture of PTSD, they've built up this weird culture. There's a bit later on in the book where they've burned a village, and after burning the village, one of the guys in the squad, who is pretty much the craziest, meanest guy in the squad, goes up and shakes the hand of one of the corpses, and then everybody in the squad's meant to do it. That they have this, again, not showing cowardice and belonging to your squad, and not standing out, not failing them, not being other, is just like, they're just feeding each other PTSD. Everyone's got their own PTSD, and then they're passing it around between them as well. It's horrible. So, some questions. If a guy in war or any other place commits heinous acts, is he the bigger villain, or the environment and people who raised him to be that?
It's a good question. It depends, I think, on whether you feel we as individuals are responsible and we have free will, and that we make decisions that are poor or evil or reprehensible, or if you believe that we are a product of our environment, our biology, and that we don't really have any free will, and that you put any one of us in that situation,
and we would do the same.
These guys are in Vietnam. I don't know what I would do. I honestly don't. Would I get to a point where I would be willing to carry a human thumb around in order to convince myself that what I'm doing isn't horrible? I don't know. I don't know how I would react in a situation like that. So it's a really good question. I don't think anybody really has a definitive answer, to be honest. Are we to blame as individuals for the acts we commit, or is it the bigger picture? Are we just basically being carried along the river, and we don't really have a whole lot of decision, a lot of say in the decision? Yeah. Erikson does, I think, too. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that in the story, or in the various stories, where, I mean, I really, not just because they were in Vietnam, but I really felt extremely sorry for some of these guys because they seemed like okay kids, but some people in their squad were actually monsters. Like where the monster side of them was able to come out in Vietnam because it wouldn't be acceptable at home, but they were almost reveling in being in Vietnam. And then if you're in a squad like that, if that becomes normal, and these are the only guys you've got, you're surrounded by an entire country that wants to kill you. Everywhere you look in the jungle could be a sniper or anything happening anytime. The only people you've got are these guys. They're your family. You're never going to stand up and say, guys, I think this is wrong. You know, like maybe you shouldn't do that. Or, you know, it's that requires more bravery, more courage than anything else, you know.
Yeah.
Lack of empathy makes good soldiers. Also makes good criminals.
Yeah, I don't know. O'Brien talks a lot about the things that they carry. And for me, I interpret that also to be a sacrifice. Like Jimmy Cross sacrifices his individuality in that moment when he burns Martha's letters and decides that he's going to be the best lieutenant he can. The fact that you're right, you do have to shut off a part of yourself in order to kill other human beings. So I'm not going to disagree with that statement. But it is also at the same time, I think, a sacrifice of a sort, isn't it? Where I don't think those of us who never serve, those of us who live comfy civilian lives, you know, do we fully appreciate that sacrifice? I don't think we have to think about it very much, and so we don't. I really feel that it's something that bears, I think, some pondering, because you have a certain segment of the population who do go through these things, and ostensibly for the greater good of the nation, right? They're out there serving their country. They're out there doing things that we wouldn't want to have to do, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you can argue whether or not those things are necessary or right or anything else, but the fact of the matter is they do have to sacrifice some of their humanity, I guess, in a sense.
Totally.
In those situations in order to carry out those duties.
I think that's where the danger of generalization comes in, because, you know, are there monsters who are soldiers? Absolutely. Are there also, you know, like you said, men who keep that empathy and are trying to, you know, they're getting through this by sacrificing part of themselves, and there's still a part of them, even in the book, that can recognize, you know, like later on in the book when Tim O'Brien goes through this fictionalized life experience of the young man that was killed on the trail from you know, like that was one that really stood out to me, because there are moments where you really see the severity and the humanity come back in a really strong way, and it completely shuts him down. You know, Kiowa is standing there and is like, "Hey, you okay? You okay? You coming?" Like, and he's just completely lost in that moment of complete humanity where he's like recognizing what he's seeing and what's happening around him. So I think, again, that's why, like, I believe in individual responsibility pretty strongly. And I think, you know, environment definitely can set you on a path one way or the other. But at the end of the day, you know, just because the hurt people excuse, which is true, but it also, I think, removes that responsibility to say, well, if I've been hurt, why do I need to break that cycle?
I can do
you know
whatever
what
I
I mean?
want.
Yeah, I could just, you know, and I want to not repeat that.
Yeah.
And I think in survival situations, we're all human. There's going to be flaws. like, we're not going to make the right decision all the time. We're not going to be able to do the right thing all the time or stand up when we should. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep trying to get back to that.
And he makes that argument, I think, in the stories really, really well. Like, there's basically only one guy in the squad where I would say, if you weren't in Vietnam, you probably would be in jail because you had murdered someone. You know, like he was ready for a Vietnam experience. But almost everybody else either keeps their humanity. Kiowa is a great example of that. He is like an admirable dude, even in the middle of all of this. And then a bunch of the other ones are confused and lost, and with some of the bad things they're going along because this is their family, basically. And it's really hard to say no, but they're not liking it, you know? Azar is the only one where I would say, yeah, you're probably
There's like
just
no moral
just
compass
kind of
there.
a monster.
Yeah.
Like, you didn't become a monster in Vietnam. You just kind of are a monster. But pretty much none of the rest of them. They're all just doing the best they can and suffering because of it.
You mentioned Kiowa, and it's interesting because he is, as if you couldn't tell from the name, he's Native American.
Yeah.
And he's the one that holds on to I think it's his grandfather's Bible is his special object. There's also, I think, a hatchet he has or something like that.
Yeah.
Hatchet, moccasins, and
Yeah.
and his grandfather's Bible,
And you mentioned how he's a decent fellow, you know. And
he seemed to me like the most decent fellow in the whole squad.
Yeah. Yeah. Trying to keep hold of his moral compass, his humanity.
Yeah.
And you might interpret the Bible then as his attempt to hold on to that morality. You know.
Francis Ford Coppola once said that us U.S. soldiers had too much money and freedom, and they were loving being people who lack empathy. I think the surfing stuff in Apocalypse Now is a great example.
I don't think I agree with Francis Ford Coppola, honestly. Maybe relative to soldiers from other countries. I grew up in the military. I did not serve in the military, but from growing up as a kid in the military, I would say the vast majority of people who join the military come from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. The vast majority. There are people who join out of a sense of patriotism. You know, they want to do something specific career-wise that the military can help them with. It helps them get through college. There's a load of reasons, but I think the backbone of the military, your average soldier
in the U.S. anyway.
In the U.S.,
they're
coming from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, and this is one of the few ways they have out of that poverty. Frankly, I don't think that's unusual historically speaking. I mean, most through human history, most people who get shot at come from poorer backgrounds, and the people who are giving the orders to do the shooting are coming from more privileged backgrounds. So I think I would just disagree with that statement by Francis Ford Coppola, as much as he's a great actor. Director.
Yeah.
If that's honestly, there are certainly people who fit that description.
For sure.
Yeah.
But your average person in the military is not like that. I think it's
the bit
trying
in
to get by
Apocalypse,
in life, you know?
The surfing bit in Apocalypse Now. I mean, to me, that always seemed like, first of all, trying to have some sort of normal in the middle of continual insanity, and also just an expression of how insane the whole thing was. You know, that the people were just cracked. You couldn't have. I mean, what is a normal reaction to what the people in that movie, what the people in that story or that war went through? You know, what would even be normal?
Yeah.
You know,
well, and it just goes to show in the book too, and I haven't seen Apocalypse Now, but how different, and this is something I try to like remind people often, is that you can have 10 people go through the exact same event, and every single one of them will carry it differently.
Yeah.
Right. It'll manifest different ways. Some you'll wonder if they even went through it at all. some they'll just like you see that repetition as a theme in this book. I thought was really well done, because that's such a PTSD thing. It's like your brain is literally stuck in a loop trying to make sense of it, you know. And I loved later on that story of Norman Bowker when he's back in the States, and he's literally the image is literally him driving in circles, looking out a window at people who are having picnics on the 4th of July. And he's forever separated from that experience the way they are having it. And he's just stuck in that wheel of repetition and trying to make it make sense in that juxtaposition of what he's experienced and people having a picnic on a Sunday. You know, like it doesn't, it's not something that you can make sense in a human brain. That those two things would coexist.
Yeah, and that's the story I was talking about, where he couldn't talk to anyone. And it's also this distance, you know, he's watching normal life from his car as he drives in a circle for hours and hours and hours, and can't be a part of that and can't bridge that gap in any way, you know. It's crazy. Yeah, no, it's a book. As soon as I finished reading it, I thought, I'm going to reread this. Because I thought it's just too much. I know. I mean, it's not like it's complicated and there's all sorts of hidden meanings, but it's just, there's a lot to process. You know, there is a lot to process. And I thought that was a lot, and I'm not going to try and reread it right now. I'm a little exhausted, but I will reread it at some point, because it was just amazing writing, and but a hard book.
And I'm trying to remember what other ones I have down on my historical fiction shelf that I'm going to get to. I'm trying to remember what it's called. We Were Soldiers Once and Young is another one that I've heard of, that I'm pretty sure is Vietnam War era, that has been recommended to me by quite a few people, that I really want to read. And then, I have a couple other ones that are kind of like this from different war eras.
Ben mentioned earlier that Tim O'Brien wrote another one called Going After Cacciato, which is more linear.
More like an actual novel.
Yeah. The things they carried feels like a bunch of short stories, but they are definitely all connected. I mean, they're all about the same soldiers, and there is kind of a chronological order of the story. But Going After Cacciato sounds more like a normal, so to speak, novel.
Yeah, I think and it's interesting looking at it as a work of fiction too, from a character standpoint, because I think the character moment that hit me the hardest was probably Kiowa's death. And I think it's probably for the same reasons that you were kind of bringing up before, where, you know, right before this, he was the one that was trying to get Tim out of his funk when he was, you know, stuck in that moment. And then later on, right before the, you know, mud field, he's sitting with this young kid and like, hey, she's cute, you know, looking at this picture of his girlfriend back home. And like, you get this sense that he's kind of an anchor in all of this. And so that was one of the moments where, character wise, where I really felt like that was a big punch in the gut.
He was the character I felt who had kept most of himself. And had dealt with everything the best. You know, I mean, he was fundamentally, before the war, he was fundamentally just a good person. But because maybe, I mean, it was certainly suggested that I think his grandfather was a preacher, and he was very strong in Christianity and all of that. And that was that was his stable foundation.
Right.
And he stuck with that.
Too.
Yeah, exactly. He stuck with that through the whole thing, and never really became a bad person or did a whole bunch of bad things, you know?
When there were all that was those moments of empathy that he was showing, even, you know, mostly with the men in the platoon, but
Yeah.
Eric says the change in narrative events were quite jarring. You mean the way the narrative changed? Because it like we have talked about just the first story, but if you go on through the book, there are stories that are in Vietnam, then there's some that are back home, then there's a couple of short chapters where Tim O'Brien is basically talking to you, the reader, and sort of explaining something to you. It's not really a story exactly. And then it goes back to Vietnam, and
Yeah. Which I think is part of the brilliance of the narrative too, because everything in here is very jarring. So it makes sense to me that the way he set it up, it fits the tone of what he's telling us.
The people involved in various scenes change. Yeah. And because it's not like a day by day kind of chronology. There are some, uncertain amounts of time jumps. And also seeing how Tim O'Brien himself, or the character of Tim O'Brien in the story, how he changes. Because he also, at the beginning of the story, he sounds like a pretty nice guy. And later in the story, some things happen. And he becomes a little angry and has some real difficulties with some people, and becomes less nice, which was also very, I found that aspect of the book extremely moving, because it feels like he's admitting to a number of things which are very hard to admit to. He did some ugly things, and he had some ugly feelings, and it's almost confessional in places. The book has a bit of a feeling of that in places.
Well, you don't come back the same person from an experience like that, and that is something that another Vietnam veteran wrote a poem called "Facing It." It's a fellow named Yusuf Komunyakaa.
I love him.
Yeah, he's a great poet.
He's a great poet.
And he's a Vietnam War veteran. And this poem, Facing It, he wrote about, I think it's pretty autobiographical. It's a poem. He's gone to visit the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. It's that, if you don't know what it is, it's that long black wall that has the 58,022, whatever it is, names carved on the granite of the soldiers who died over in Vietnam. And it's just a very moving poem. But one of the things that comes across so strongly is how he's a African American, and he begins the poem with my black face fades inside the granite, or something like it. It's black granite. Something, I'm missing it up, but anyway, the idea is some of his identity is in that memorial. In other words, is still back in Vietnam. He's not the same person that went to that war. That it has claimed part of him. And there's this constant interplay in that poem between what he's, as an outsider looking into that wall looking at, and the memories that are from the war are swirling around in him. You don't know if something's happening in the present or if it's happening in his memories. But what comes across so powerfully is that, you don't come back the same person. It claims part of you. There's literally another vet next to him. And it's not clear in the poem, but it could be the fact is he's missing an arm. Or it might be just his reflection in the granite, the way it looks. So it's not quite clear, but either way, the wall has his arm. The war has his arm. It has a piece of him, right? And of course, the friends you lost there, the people you lost over there, that sort of thing. So it's a great poem. It's not that long. It's like a page long. But it gets across some of the same, I think, themes that the story, the things that Carrie does.
Yeah.
It occurred to me at some point when I was reading it that the title feels like half of the title. Like, after reading a bunch of it, I was like, okay, it's actually the things they carried and the things they left behind. Because everybody is constantly sacrificing something, giving up something. Like you said, with Cross, he burns all the letters and he drops the pebble and leaves it there. And other people lose parts of their bodies, and there's a lot of leaving stuff in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had the opportunity when I was in college. We went to a poetry reading at, well, it was Minnesota State, up here in Minnesota. And Yusuf was there and did a reading, and that, like, I've been a poet long before I was a fiction writer, and I just he's one of my favorite poet voices I've ever, and to hear him read his own poetry was just, I was just like blown away by it. And when you mentioned that, I actually read last year his War Horses poetry book. And it's funny now that you mention that, how similar the kind of raw stream of consciousness is to the things they carried. So yeah, this is like, honestly, if anybody has read that and hasn't, like, this would, some of his poetry might be a good like add on to that.
Do you think, or do we think, bad people are born with empathy and by their environment they are turned into bad people? And our good people were born animals, but they were taught empathy. I mean, even with Malazan.
Scarecrow sees that as a possible, yeah. It's a complex question with I don't think anyone again can definitively answer it. I think you're right that Erikson takes on this theme in Malazan for sure.
For sure.
But what Erikson usually does is he doesn't give you an answer. He wants you, he's exploring something and he's wanting you to think about it, but he never says, yep, and this is the way it is, you know? Mm-hmm. So it's a really great question though. And I think it can happen either way, that sometimes there are people who have every privilege you could possibly want and they still do bad things.
Yeah.
And then there are people who have incredibly difficult lives and are still wonderful, just, you know, beautiful, empathetic people. So, you know, it's just, you can have any combination of whatever you want. And so it's beyond my ability really to answer that question.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would also say some of the kindest, most generous people I've ever met were people who had had remarkably difficult lives and had compared to me, had nothing. You know, they were extremely poor or also pieces of their body missing. And you know, I know some people like that where I'm just like, these are the nicest people I've ever met.
Yep. And
a lot of the least pleasant people I've met have, like you said, they've got every privilege you can imagine. And it hasn't made them good people. But I don't know. I mean, I tend to kind of think when someone's born, if their brain chemistry is normal, they could go any direction. You know, you can also be born with something going on in your brain that makes you behave in a certain way. But if we're talking about a sort of average, normal brain, then lots of, and just because you've had a hard life, or just because someone has abused you, or just because whatever, doesn't mean you're going to end up being a really unpleasant person, you know?
Yeah. What was the name of the guy? I forget his name, but you've all read about this in a psychology class, I'm sure. The one guy who was working on a railroad and there was something blew up when it wasn't supposed to, and a spike or something, a metal rod went through his head. And it before the incident, he was a really nice guy, like a super nice guy. But the metal, he lived somehow. They took the rod out of him and he survived this horrible accident. But he was afterwards a really mean, horrible person. Like some part of his brain got destroyed, the empathy part of the brain or whatever. And he, after that particular, you know, after he recovered from it, was a mean, not nice person anymore. It's just kind of scary.
Maybe,
you could remove one part of my brain and then make me a meanie pants, you know?
A meanie pants. That you're worried about becoming a meanie pants.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that's valid.
I think just by saying that word, you have guaranteed that you will never be a meanie pants. It's
I don't
impossible
think that is
for
a
a
word I
mean
would
person
ever
to say that
associate
word.
with Philip.
No. It's
But
also
you know,
a word I would
you
never
know what I'm
personally
talking
use.
about, right?
Yeah.
guys know about that.
I think he just had a headache.
I bet he had a headache.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got a permanent headache because you've had a spike through your head, then
one's
I would
genocide.
probably become a bit of a meanie pants too.
Was it Phineas Gage or something? No, that's a fictional character.
No,
What was
I'm
the guy's
trying to-
name?
I know. I'm trying to remember.
Is it Phineas something? Somebody in the chat can find out for us.
So does this mean that AP had a spike through his head? Is that the logical conclusion?
Oh no!
Back when he was working
Phineas
on the
Gage.
railroad?
You're right, Philip.
Was that right?
Yeah, Phineas Gage. Let's see. When did that happen?
That's still working here.
In the mid 1800s.
Yeah. He was from Vermont too, where I'm from, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Scarecrow, I think I have to disagree with you on this as well. The biggest thing about the human condition is lack of empathy throughout history.
History has lots of examples of that. But
sure, it's a thing. I just wouldn't agree it's the biggest thing about the human condition throughout all of history. People keep doing horrible things. I mean, one thing that seems that humans are pretty good at, and this is also, of course, a theme in this book, is being good to our people and being less good to those people. Dividing ourselves into groups
Us
and having
versus
sides.
them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The whole us versus them thing. But then also being extremely kind and generous and all of the good things to the people that you count as your group. And then much less so to the others.
Well, people fear what they don't understand, right? Like it's,
Yeah.
when it's something that's completely foreign to us and what we're used to in our own environment, an instinctual reaction is oftentimes, well, that's the wrong or the bad because it's not what I am or am used to. And I think that's which
and
is
that's
a
another
sad mindset.
that's another Ericksonian theme, though, isn't it? The idea that our circle of who we think of as us, depending on the size of that circle, we've gone from a stage of our evolution where that circle was really small. And that circle has been, I think, getting larger through human history to some degree. I mean, you can, to the point where you can think of yourself as a human, not as belonging to this country or this kingdom or this tribe or whatever, right? You could think of yourself as being in communion with all of humanity and maybe even the rest of the natural world to some degree. But that's the thing, I think, is exactly what you were saying, Matt. It depends on who you identify with, right? So if you can otherize somebody outside of your little circle, they're evil, they're bad, so therefore we can kill them. But if
I
think
think
as like you, then that becomes impossible.
I think also this what Eric said here, that you can't really remain sane trying to be empathetic with those that you are killing who are also trying to kill you. And I mean, like the kids we're talking about in this book, none of this was their choice. Like, I'm sure none of them thought about people in Vietnam before they went to Vietnam, really. Like individual people, they didn't care. I mean, he sort of covers that when he's talking about himself getting drafted. He had some political thoughts, but it was all kind of abstract. And he'd certainly never thought about, the Vietnamese as any kind of enemy or anything like that. But then when you're there and everybody around you is trying to kill you, and you have orders to kill them if you find them, then you have to identify with, like, okay, it's just me and my platoon and everybody else around us is enemy, because you would go insane if you were trying to be. Although that's the interesting thing there, that one of the stories that Tori mentioned, where Tim O'Brien himself, or his character, basically stumbles on a guy, is surprised by a Viet Cong fighter and kills him. And the whole time he's looking at the body and he's making up the story in his head of who this guy was. You know, and he's got this very rich story about the guy's family and what the guy was doing before the war and all of this sort of stuff. And he's actively humanizing him, you know, because he is so traumatized that he had to, in a very personal way, kill someone. You know, it wasn't like there's a guy really far away and the whole platoon shooting and, you know, somebody gets hit. It was like him and this guy, and he was a handful of meters away, and boom, he's dead. So yeah, he is empathizing with him, but that is also sort of the moment in the book that most breaks him, you know.
Yeah, because it sounds like in that moment, he can't escape the humanity of the person that he killed. Right?
Yeah,
Because
because
it's right there.
well, it's first of all, it's personal. It's like there was one guy and he killed him, and that's it.
Right.
You know, it was very personal, and he's right there. His body is on the ground in front of you.
Yeah.
It's not some guy in a tree far away or something. You know, it's like he's right there. You can see him. He's visualizing very strongly the corpse as well. He's looking at this body and describing exactly how he's laying, and you know, yeah.
Yeah, there are moments like that in books like All Quiet on the Western Front, for example. Right?
Yeah.
Where two guys in a basically a hole made by a bomb, and suddenly they're like the opposing soldiers, and they're like, "Oh, you're human here."
Yeah.
And there's this kind of weird, you know, dance that goes on, you know, but often ending in something fatal. And more
that was really weird. It's a movie that everybody, at least my age in Australia, would have seen. It's Gallipoli. Just an amazing movie. I think it was actually the first movie Mel Gibson was in, like real movie, or maybe it was after Mad Max. But anyway, it's a horrible, horrible piece of the war that nobody thinks about except Australians and Kiwis, because the ANZ, the Anzacs, the ANZ, Australia, New Zealand, they were sent to Gallipoli to take it. It's a part of the coast in Turkey, and the British, who were in command, again, like you said, rich people telling people what to do, poorer people are the ones getting shot. They sent them at the most fortified place there was. Ooh. And they basically just said, take it. And when they realized exactly what position they were in, they said, oh, and don't load your weapons. Because the British were like, there's no use wasting ammunition.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So you had these kids charging up over the top of a trench, charging at the German trenches where they had crossfire machine guns just set up. They just mowed them all down. And I don't remember why I brought this up now. We were talking about something before that, and it reminded me of Gallipoli.
I think seeing the humanity.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, there's a scene in it where they're all dug in, and both sides take a break. They call a temporary truce. They go out and get their dead bodies, and they actually exchange cigarettes and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, they have this very human break, and then they're like, okay, let's go back to killing each other. And that happened all through the Germans, and I think it was the British, when in France also had a period where they celebrated Christmas together.
That's right.
You know. Yeah. We are very lucky. This book reminded me how lucky we are. Yeah. We who don't have to do this. And we're born at the right time to not get drafted. My strange fact. My dad programmed the draft for the Vietnam War.
Wow.
He was a computer programmer in the 60s, and he worked in the basement of the Pentagon, and he programmed the program that randomly chose names.
Bye, AP.
See you, AP. And he secretly put in a list of all of his friends who could not be chosen.
Really?
Wow.
Yeah, he had an exception list that was in the program, and if any of these names came up, it would choose again.
Wow.
Hmm.
Huh.
Yeah.
Boy, did his friends ever know that he did that?
Well, he told me the story pretty openly, so I imagine they might have known. I don't know.
Huh.
Yeah. But I'm sure back at that time they didn't know, because it was, of course, like he could get court-martialed for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's dead now, so I'm not getting him in trouble. So
Right.
don't have to worry about that.
Moral of the story is it pays to be a computer programmer.
Well, it kept him from having to go to Vietnam. He was in the army, but he didn't have to go to Vietnam because, like, programming was a lot more valuable than just going somewhere to get shot, you know?
Yeah.
People don't lack empathy. Societies often don't have it. Yeah. Yeah. True.
Although there are certainly, I think, some people who have something different with their brains.
Oh, there are certainly people who lack empathy.
Yeah. I'm not saying anyone's name in particular here, but I think there are people who just are devoid of empathy, and to me, there's just something wrong with them. They're missing a part or something up there. But
Have to disagree with you again, Scarecrow.
Again.
I
Yep.
think Scarecrow's being a little sarcastic on that.
Yeah. I know people who believe that, and yeah, the Soviet Union doesn't get a whole lot of points for being humanitarian. and
Yeah,
caring and
empathic.
kind. Yeah, no, it has to do with people more than it has to do with any particular set of values. I think it's sad but true. But I mean, books like this always make me want to be more empathetic and compassionate. You know, I mean, that's a good thing about this is you can read it, and unlike a lot of fantasy books, there is nothing in this book that made me think that war is good or fun or
Right.
glorious or anything like that. I read this book and I think, oh my God, what are people doing?
Yep.
Let's never do that again. You know, and I'm not a complete pacifist or anything. I mean, I think wars are sometimes necessary. I think the Vietnam War probably wasn't really, but yeah, it makes you just want nobody to ever have to do that.
Yep.
You know, reading a book like this. So I think it actually helps the empathy grow, hopefully. You know.
Yeah, that's really well said, Matt. I think that's one of the most important things we can take from storytelling is that idea that you can learn someone else's experience, you can identify with that other person, you can learn empathy for that perspective. And O'Brien's stories to me are so terribly important because I think it is an obligation, frankly, for people, those of us who don't go through those experiences, to try our best to understand what it is like to go through that. So I think it's a tremendous service in a way that O'Brien has done in putting these stories down, whether they're literally true or in a bigger way true. He's giving me, and I think anyone else who wants to experience that, an opportunity to try to understand, to build empathy, which is why, you know, a lot of those soldiers who came back from Vietnam were booed and jeered and called baby killers and that sort of thing. And I think we learned from that to be less ready to blame. This goes back to somebody's question earlier, actually. Is it the individual's fault or the society's fault? I think we learned from that to be less quick to blame the individual soldiers and more apt to point out the societal error, you know,
Yeah.
or the people in power who made these conflicts happen or didn't avoid them, at least put it that way.
Yeah.
Where does the responsibility lie with the people getting shot at or the people who put them over there?
Yeah.
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 Yeah. And just that a lot of these things are not black and white.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, I guess as I've gotten older, that's the most important thing I think anyone can learn is that nothing is absolutely black and white. There are no simple answers. Like the hippies hating the soldiers coming back. I mean, the soldiers would have been perfectly happy not to do what they did.
Right.
You know, they weren't people who went over there wanting to kill babies or anything like that. You know,
Right.
they were sent over there. Many of them against their will, and they did many of them horrible things. Yes, no question.
But the question is, would I have done that if I had been in that situation?
Yeah, exactly. Like it's very easy to look like you're clean and very ethical when you're sitting at home,
Right. In my tweed.
in your tweed with your glasses, and they have to be over there marching through the mud and getting shot at and blown up, and then they come back and they look like they've done horrible things because you've been sitting there reading books, you know?
Yeah.
So, yeah, empathy for the soldiers as well.
Yeah.
More than almost anything, you know, horrible experiences.
Yeah.
Well, it seems like we're maybe wrapping up.
Yeah.
If there are any last remarks, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I would encourage, just, you know, going back to when we were talking about how it changes writing. People that want to write, you know, military fiction, fantasy, getting into books like this and just really getting a more, you know, and not just this, but read like a variety of perspectives on, you know, war experience, because I do think there does come a point where we kind of, yeah, like you said, it gets kind of glorified, and then that's what people take away from it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, it's funny considering what Tolkien's experience probably was.
Yeah.
His wars were much more about glory. Like he didn't get into the PTSD side of
Except in the
things.
Silmarillion, he did some.
Well, in this, yeah, but like in the Lord of the Rings, the battles are good guys fighting gloriously against evil, you know.
Yes, and the Hobbit, yeah.
And there's no down in the trenches.
Well, and the evil is very clearly dehumanized. Also, like we have,
Yeah,
you know, it's the humans versus the orcs. You know, it's not the humans versus the humans.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas Erickson and Cook really do start getting into what's it really like if you're sitting in the mud.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you both for joining me. This was a pleasure. The rough plan, I don't know if we've really concretely planned like dates and things, but Tori and I want to read the first book of The Black Company at least together, and then invite Alan for a chat, which I think will be on Tori's channel, was the plan. And that may be next month, but we'll see. Herr Professor Dr. Fantasy and I are reading the Book of the New Sun together,
Nice.
starting next month. And we will also be having a live chat that we haven't really scheduled exactly.
No, yeah, we haven't quite planned all that out.
But we will at some point.
My
soon.
husband is a huge Gene Wolfe fan. Gene Wolfe is one of his favorite authors.
Cool.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you both. Have a good afternoon, Sunday afternoon, and a good week. Thanks everybody in the chat. Pleasure that you were here.
Thank you everybody in the chat.
Yeah.
Thank you,
And
Matt.
thanks for joining us, Philip. I was glad when Matt and I were chatting about it and he mentioned that you might be somebody to ask. I was really glad that you were able to jump on with that.
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you for having me. It's always enlightening, I think, for us to share our experiences of a certain read, and you guys have helped me to appreciate the things they carried even more.
Awesome.
Cool.
Same.
See you all later.